Chapter 1. The biting frost woke her before the screams did. Ovidia gasped, her back arching off a slab of jagged ice-covered stone. Freezing air tore into her empty lungs. She was alive. She shouldn't be alive. Ash rained from a fractured sky, painting the snow-choked forest in strokes of gray and crimson. Beyond the tree line, the Umbral Kingdom burned. The scent of charred pine and spilled blood hung thick in the air. "Get up, dead girl," a voice rasped. Ovidia flinched. A raven with feathers like spilled ink landed on her chest, its dark eyes gleaming with unnatural intelligence. "I am Bramwell," the bird clicked, its beak snapping. "The pact has pulled your soul from the void, but your borrowed time expires in exactly 5 minutes. Ovidia pushed herself up, her limbs trembling. 5 minutes? "Unless you kiss the king," Bramwell squawked, taking flight. "The Alpha is losing his mind to the demon blight. Kiss him or return to the dirt. Run!" She ran. She didn't question the talking bird or the impossible magic humming in her newly beating heart. Survival was a primal instinct, and it propelled her forward. She burst through the burning tree line. The battlefield was a nightmare of claws and shadow. And there, in the center of the carnage, was Thorne. He was a towering force of violence. His royal armor was shredded, exposing skin corded with feral muscle. He tore through the abyssal creatures with his bare hands, but something was terribly wrong. Veins of unnatural black poison spider-webbed up his throat. His eyes, usually a piercing silver, wept thick tears of blood. The Alpha King was turning into a monster. A demon lunged at his blind spot, its scythe-like claws raised. Ovidia didn't think. She threw herself across the blood-soaked snow. The beast's claws sliced through her shoulder, a brilliant flash of pain that knocked the breath from her ribs. But she used the momentum to crash directly into Thorne's solid chest. He snarled, a deafening sound that shook her bones, and raised a blood-soaked fist to strike her down. Ovidia grabbed the ruined collar of his tunic. She pulled herself up and crashed her lips against his. The world stopped. The kiss was a collision of ice and hellfire. Thorne tasted of copper, ash, and pure, devastating power. A visceral jolt of energy surged from her mouth into his, violent and bright. Her heart hammered a frantic rhythm against his unyielding chest. Despite the terror gripping her throat, a strange, electric heat bloomed in her stomach. The demonic aura suffocating the air instantly vanished. Thorne tore his mouth away, gasping as the crimson faded from his eyes, leaving behind a striking, furious silver. For a split second, Ovidia thought she had saved them both. Then his hand shot out. His fingers clamped around her throat, cutting off her air. With terrifying ease, the Alpha lifted her entirely off the frozen ground. "Are you an assassin or a spy?" Thorne growled, his voice a lethal, vibrating threat. His thumb pressed dangerously against her pulse point. "Answer me. What foul magic did you just force into my veins?" Chapter 2. The dungeon floor was unforgiving and damp. Ovidia hit the stone with a muted gasp as the iron door slammed shut, sealing her in darkness. Her throat still throbbed from the king's brutal grip. A flutter of wings disturbed the stagnant air. Bramwell materialized on a rusted sconce. "Congratulations on surviving," the raven clicked. "Task 2. The king must marry you before the sun sets tomorrow. Fail, and the pact terminates." Ovidia stared at the bird, disbelief warring with the lingering phantom heat of the Alpha's mouth. "Marry me? He just tried to snap my neck. Better get creative, dead girl." Hours bled into the cold stone before heavy boots echoed down the corridor. The door swung open. 2 armored guards hauled her up, dragging her through a labyrinth of torch-lit halls until they reached the throne room. King Thorne sat upon an obsidian seat. Without the madness clouding his features, he was devastatingly handsome. High, sharp cheekbones framed eyes as cold as a winter storm. He watched her approach with calculated stillness. "The poison in my blood is dormant," Thorne stated, his voice a low, commanding rumble. "My healers cannot explain it, but they confirm your touch drew the blight from my soul." Ovidia lifted her chin, fighting the urge to cower. "I am the only cure you have," she said, projecting a confidence she did not feel. "That kiss bought you time, but the demon curse will return. You know this." Thorne's jaw tightened. "What are you demanding in exchange for your services?" "A crown." The words left her lips before her courage could falter. "Marry me. Make me your queen. In return, I will keep the madness at bay. A marriage of convenience. I get protection, and you get to keep your sanity." The throne room fell utterly silent. Thorne descended the steps slowly, stalking toward her like a predator, cornering its prey. He stopped mere inches away, his towering frame casting a long shadow over her. He leaned down, his face dangerously close to hers. Ovidia could feel the heat radiating from his skin, carrying that intoxicating scent of pine and impending storm. "You are bold, little witch," he murmured, his eyes tracking the frantic flutter of her pulse. "Or entirely foolish." "I am necessary," she corrected, refusing to back down. A tense heartbeat passed. Thorne's gaze lingered on her lips, a flicker of something unreadable masking his cold exterior. The lingering memory of their kiss hung heavy between them. "Prepare the royal sept," Thorne commanded without turning around. "We wed at noon." The next day moved in a chaotic blur. Servants scrubbed the dungeon grime from her skin, wrapping her in a gown of spun ivory and silver thread. When she finally walked down the aisle of the grand hall, the air was thick with the scent of winter roses and hostility. Thorne waited at the altar. He looked every inch the formidable Alpha King, his presence demanding absolute submission. He took her hand, his calloused fingers sending a sharp, unexpected thrill up her arm. "We are bound by necessity," he whispered for her ears alone. "Only necessity," Ovidia agreed softly. The high priest raised his hands to seal the binding vow. Before the final words could leave his lips, the heavy oak doors of the hall blew open with a deafening crash. A royal priestess marched down the center aisle, her robes billowing, her eyes wide with terror. She pointed a trembling, accusatory finger directly at Ovidia. "Do not let her deceive you, my king," the woman shrieked, her voice echoing off the vaulted ceilings. "That creature is not a living being. Her heart does not beat." Chapter 3. Chaos erupted. Nobles gasped, backing away as if Ovidia carried the plague. Thorne did not flinch. His grip on Ovidia's hand tightened, his silver eyes flashing with sudden dominating authority. "Silence!" he commanded. The single word rolled through the hall like a thunderclap, instantly suffocating the panic. He glared at the priestess. "She is my chosen mate. Her secrets belong to me, not to the court. Proceed with the ceremony." The priest swallowed hard, rushing through the final rites. Within minutes, the crown of Umbral was placed upon Ovidia's head, but there was no royal celebration. Thorne marched her directly to the royal bedchamber, his hand like a vice around her arm. He shoved her inside and locked the heavy door behind them. "You will remain here," Thorne ordered, his tone brokering no argument, "until I decide what to do with the dead woman walking." Night fell quickly, blanketing the castle in shadows. Ovidia sat by the hearth, exhaustion pulling at her bones. Thorne paced the room, a restless beast. Despite his harsh words, he refused to leave her side. Around midnight, the temperature in the room plummeted. The fire in the hearth extinguished instantly. Thorne spun around, a low growl tearing from his chest. Shadows detached from the walls, morphing into towering abyssal hounds. The demons had tracked the king. Thorne shifted instantly. His bones cracked and reformed, transforming him into a colossal midnight-furred wolf. He threw himself at the hounds, tearing into shadow and flesh. But there were too many. A hound clamped its jaws onto Thorne's flank, injecting pure venomous blight into his bloodstream. The alpha roared in agony, his form shuddering as he reverted to his human shape, collapsing onto the frozen floor. Ovidia did not hesitate. She dropped to her knees beside him. The dark poison was traveling up his neck, blackening his veins. She placed both hands flat against his chest. Closing her eyes, she summoned the soul weaver magic the pact had gifted her. "Take it from him," she whispered. Pain, sharper than any blade, ripped through her hands and traveled up her arms. She inhaled sharply as the toxic miasma flowed out of the king and into her own body. It felt like swallowing broken glass. The demons dissolved into ash without their dark magic to sustain them. Ovidia slumped sideways, coughing violently. Thorne pushed himself up, his breathing ragged. He looked at the black veins fading from his own skin, then at Ovidia, who lay curled on the stone floor, trembling in agony. The cold, calculating wall he had built around himself fractured. He gathered her into his arms, pulling her against his chest. "You foolish girl," he murmured, his voice thick with an emotion he could not hide. He brushed the hair from her sweat-dampened forehead. "You traded your life for mine." Ovidia looked up at him, her vision swimming. The genuine fear in his eyes made her chest ache with something far more profound than the poison. He was a tyrant, yes, but he was also a man fighting a lonely war in the dark. Thorne gently wiped a trail of blood from the corner of her mouth with his thumb. The tenderness of the gesture made her heart perform a strange, erratic flutter. "Progress stands at 50%. A harsh squawk shattered the quiet intimacy. Bramwell the raven fluttered down from the rafters, landing on the bedpost. "Keep this up, dead girl, and you'll finish the conquest quest in no time. Then you'll be completely free of this brute." Ovidia froze. The air in the room turned to ice. Thorne's hand stilled against her cheek. The tenderness vanished from his eyes, replaced by a chilling, absolute void. He slowly lowered her to the floor and stood up. Conquest quest. Thorne's voice was barely a whisper, yet it cut deeper than any shout. "You approached me. You saved me, simply to fulfill a task?" Chapter 4. The silence that followed the raven's words was suffocating. Thorne stared at her, his expression a terrifying mask of betrayal. "Thorne, please," Ovidia rasped, clutching her ribs as she tried to sit up. "It isn't what you think, isn't it?" His voice cracked like a whip. He turned his back on her, the line of his shoulders rigid with a fury so profound it felt tangible. "Lock the doors," he shouted to the guards outside. "The queen is not to leave this room, not for any reason." He walked out without looking back. For 3 days, Ovidia remained a prisoner in the lavish bedchamber. Thorne did not return. The absence of his scent, the lack of his grounding presence, left a hollow ache in her chest that rivaled the lingering pain of the demon poison. On the 3rd night, the temperature plummeted again. But this time no demons breached the walls. Instead, the shadows in the corner of the room coalesced into a towering, shapeless entity, the true architect of the pact. "You have dawdled long enough, little puppet," the ancient god hissed, its voice echoing in the confines of her mind. The Alpha's heart is fractured. His demon side is rising to consume his grief. The time to harvest him is now. No, Ovidia whispered, backing away. I won't let you hurt him. You have no choice. The pact demands his life tonight, or your soul will be obliterated into the void. A deafening roar shook the castle foundations. Through the thick oak doors, Ovidia heard the sounds of shattering stone and panicked screams. Thorne's grief had finally broken his restraint. The night demon inside him was taking control. Ovidia threw her weight against the locked doors. "Let me out!" she screamed. The lock gave way with a metallic snap, broken from the outside by a fleeing guard. She ran through the corridors, following the trail of destruction to the grand courtyard. Thorne was there. He was magnificent and terrifying, half man, half abyssal beast, surrounded by an aura of pure destructive energy. The royal guards cowered behind pillars, unable to approach their feral king. "Kill him," the ancient god's voice commanded in her head, slipping a dagger of pure shadow into her hand. "Plunge this into his heart, and you shall live." Ovidia walked slowly into the courtyard. The snow crunched beneath her bare feet. Thorne turned. His eyes were entirely pitch black. He bared his fangs, a deep, rumbling growl shaking the courtyard. But he did not attack her. Even in his madness, some primal part of his soul recognized his mate. Ovidia looked at the shadow dagger in her hand. She looked at the man who had shown her flashes of immense vulnerability beneath his cruel exterior. "I am so sorry, Thorne," she whispered. She raised the blade, but instead of striking the king, she turned the dagger and sliced a deep gash across her own palm. Blood spilled onto the white snow. With her uninjured hand, she traced a glowing golden rune of banishment into the air, using her life force to sever the pact entirely. The backlash was immediate and catastrophic. "You dare!" the ancient god shrieked, the sound fading into the void as the contract broke. Ovidia dropped the dagger. Her body suddenly felt weightless. She looked down at her hands. Her fingertips were dissolving into glowing motes of starlight, scattering into the winter wind. Thorne's dark aura shattered. The blackness bled from his eyes, leaving his brilliant silver gaze wide with absolute horror. He lunged forward, dropping to his knees as she fell. "Ovidia!" he roared, his voice tearing at the seams. He reached out, his massive hands desperately trying to hold her together, trying to catch the dissolving light. Ovidia offered him a sad, beautiful smile. She lifted a fading, translucent hand to his cheek. "I never wanted to hurt you," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the howling wind. Thorne screamed her name, a feral, heart-wrenching sound of pure agony. But his arms closed around nothing but empty air. Chapter 5. The courtyard was dead silent. Thorne remained on his knees in the snow, his hands grasping at the lingering sparkles of light that used to be his mate. He had lost her. The realization hit him with the force of a physical blow, hollowing out his chest and leaving nothing but a bleeding void. The throne, the kingdom, the power. It all meant nothing. "I will not accept this," Thorne growled to the empty night. He rose to his feet. There was an ancient, forbidden magic hidden deep within the royal archives, a magic that allowed an alpha to cross the veil between the living and the dead, the Underrealm. He didn't care about the consequences. He didn't care if it cost him his crown or his life. He was going to get her back. Thorne marched to the catacombs. He cut his own palm, letting his royal blood spill onto the ancient gateway, embedded in the floor. The stone ground open with a deafening screech, revealing a swirling vortex of absolute darkness. Without a second thought, he stepped into the abyss. The underrealm was a wasteland of jagged obsidian and rivers of fire. Millions of demons swarmed the landscape, drawn instantly to the scent of a living Alpha King. Thorne did not hesitate. He shifted into his colossal wolf form. He became a tempest of fangs and claws, a singular force of vengeance carving a bloody path through the horde. He ignored the burning claws that tore at his flanks. He ignored the illusions that whispered cruel lies in his ears. He fought for hours, or perhaps days. Time held no meaning in the dark. Finally, he reached the center of the abyss. Suspended in a cage of dark magic was Ovidia, her eyes closed, her soul fading. The ancient god loomed over her, a mass of shifting eyes and teeth. Thorne shifted back to his human form, ignoring the exhaustion threatening to pull him under. He launched himself at the cage, his fists glowing with raw, untamed alpha power. He shattered the magical barrier with a single devastating blow. He caught Ovidia as she fell, pulling her tightly against his chest. "I have you," he breathed into her hair. But as he turned to escape, the ancient god struck. A spear of concentrated miasma shot through the darkness, moving faster than sound. Thorne spun around, shielding Ovidia with his own body. The spear pierced cleanly through his back, emerging from his chest. Thorne gasped, his knees buckling. He collapsed onto the obsidian floor, pulling Ovidia down with him. He looked up at her, a bloody, exhausted smile curving his lips. "Now," he coughed, blood spilling over his chin. "It is my turn to save you." Chapter 6. Ovidia's eyes snapped open. The cold shock of reality hit her instantly. Thorne was dying in her arms. The spear of miasma dissolved, leaving a gaping, fatal wound in his chest. His blood soaked through her tattered dress. "Thorne! No, 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 please!" Ovidia sobbed, pressing her hands frantically over the wound. "You are free," Thorne whispered, his silver eyes dimming. His hand weakly gripped hers. "Live, my queen." "I refuse to live without you," she screamed. A primal, fierce instinct surged from the deepest recesses of her soul. She was a soul weaver. She had the power to bind, to heal, to connect, but to pull a soul back from the brink of the underrealm required a tether stronger than magic. It required a true mate bond. Ovidia wrapped her arms tightly around Thorne's broad shoulders. She tilted her head, exposing her fangs, and buried them deep into the crook of his neck. She bit down, forcing the ancient, unbroken connection of the mate bond to cement between them. A blinding, incandescent light exploded from the point of contact. The bond roared to life, a torrential river of golden energy that bridged their two fractured souls. Ovidia poured every ounce of her life force, her love, and her desperation into the connection. The light enveloped them entirely. It acted as a beacon of absolute purity, incinerating the dark miasma within Thorne's body. The fatal wound on his chest began to knit together, muscle and sinew reforming under the miraculous power of their shared soul. The blinding light expanded outward, catching the ancient god in its radius. The deity shrieked as the purifying energy burned away its shadow, dissolving it into nothingness forever. The underrealm fractured around them. The ground gave way, and gravity inverted. They were thrown violently through the spatial rift, crashing heavily onto the cold marble floor of the umbral throne room. Ovidia gasped for air, the world spinning around her. She pushed herself up on trembling arms and looked down. Thorne lay completely motionless on the marble. He coughed once, a splatter of dark blood staining his lips, and then his eyes fluttered shut. Panic seized Ovidia by the throat. She pressed her ear to his broad chest. Silence, the terrifying absolute silence of a heart that had stopped beating. Chapter 7. "Thorne!" Ovidia shrieked, her hands pressing desperately against his chest. "Come back to me. You promised." Tears streamed down her face, falling onto his still features. The silence stretched for 3 agonizing seconds. Then, a faint rhythmic thumping began beneath her palms. Thump, thump, thump. The heartbeat grew stronger, fueled by the newly forged mate bond that pulsed like a golden tether between them. The final remnants of the demon curse had been purged, leaving Thorne's body entirely his own. His silver eyes snapped open, clear and fiercely bright. He drew in a massive, ragged breath and immediately pulled Ovidia down against his chest, wrapping his arms around her so tightly she could barely breathe. "You are here," he murmured into her hair, his voice rough with emotion. "You are real." "I am here," she sobbed, burying her face in his neck. "I am never leaving." 6 months later, the Umbral Kingdom thrived under a new dawn. The castle was alive with music and warmth, preparing for the new moon festival. Ovidia stood in the grand hall, directing servants as they draped silver banners across the pillars. She laughed at something one of the cooks said, feeling a sense of absolute, profound peace. Then the world tilted sideways. A wave of sudden, intense dizziness washed over her. Ovidia swayed, her vision blacking out for a terrifying second before she crumpled to the floor. A thunderous roar echoed through the hall. Thorne appeared like a blur of motion, shoving aside tables and guards to reach her. He dropped to his knees, his face pale with raw terror. "Healers! Now!" he bellowed, his alpha aura flaring so violently the windows rattled. He gathered Ovidia into his arms, his hands shaking. "Ovidia, open your eyes. Is it the miasma? Is the curse back? Oh, stop your dramatic whining, you oversized brute." A familiar, annoying squawk sounded from above. Bramwell fluttered down, landing on a nearby chandelier. "It's not dark magic, you paranoid tyrant," the raven clicked, tilting its head. "It's a localized, highly concentrated surge of hybrid energy. She's pregnant, you fool." The entire grand hall went dead silent. Thorne froze. He blinked once, twice, staring at the raven, and then slowly looked down at Ovidia, who was just beginning to flutter her eyes open. "Pregnant?" Thorne's voice was a breathless, staggering whisper. The terrifying, ruthless Alpha King of Umbral was visibly trembling. Ovidia smiled weakly, placing a gentle hand over her stomach. "Surprise," she murmured. Later that night, moonlight spilled through the tall windows of the royal bedchamber. Thorne knelt on the floor beside the bed. The once feared tyrant looked up at her with eyes full of absolute, unconditional adoration. He leaned forward and pressed an achingly tender kiss to the swell of her stomach. "I swear on my wolf, on my soul, and on this kingdom," Thorne whispered fiercely, looking up to meet her eyes. "I will protect our family until my last breath." Ovidia's clear, bright laughter filled the room, a sound of pure joy that chased away any lingering shadows. From the windowsill, Bramwell let out a grumpy croak, demanding midnight snacks. The darkness was gone. For Ovidia and Thorne, the real fairy tale had just begun.